The Valley That Forgot the Stars. Chapter 1. The Closed Sky. By the time the second bell rang from the meeting post in the center of the valley, Vagon was already halfway down the eastern terraces, with mud on his boots and a calf rope over one shoulder. Morning lay soft over the fields, blue, white, and cool, the kind of light that made the dew glease on every blade of grain and turned the stream to polished silver. Beyond the last rows of winter root and bean vine, the pasture opened in a gentle fold of land dotted with sheep and the low, broad-backed cattle that his family had raised for as long as anyone could remember. The valley held everything it needed: soil, water, timber from the orchard groves, grazing land, stone from the lower ridge, fish from the ponds. It had always held enough. That was what people said when they spoke of the valley with pride. It is enough. It has always been enough. Vagon had heard it all his life. He ducked under the fence post where the latch never sat right and scanned the pasture. 43 cattle, he counted again. 42. He muttered under his breath. Elian, his younger sister, crouched near the stream with a woven basket in her lap, looked up with a face full of innocence, so complete it had to be false. "What? We're missing Brindle." "No, you're missing Brindle." "That's exactly what I said." Dalen grinned and went back to washing turnips in the cold water. "Maybe she got tired of your face." Vagon gave her a long look. "If Father asks, you were helping?" "I am helping. You're sitting. I'm guarding the turnips." He started to answer, then let it go. There was no winning with Dalen before breakfast. He whistled once, sharply, and headed for the far end of the pasture where the grass thickened near the old stone boundary markers. The valley spread around him in familiar layers. Farmhouses clustered along the central road, smoke rising in pale lines from breakfast fires. The meeting post standing dark and straight near the square. The mill wheel turning in the stream. Children carried feed buckets. 2 elders were already bent over the herb plots. From this angle he could see all the way to the western rise, where orchards climbed in neat green bands until they ended at the cliffs. The cliffs enclosed everything. They rose sheer and smooth in some places, jagged and broken in others, but always impossibly high. They ringed the valley like the walls of a bowl, shutting out whatever lay beyond. No one spoke of crossing them except in jest, and even the jokes had an edge to them. Once, when Vagon was 7, he had asked his grandmother what was on the other side. "More stone," she had said. "How do you know?" Because no one has ever come back saying otherwise. That had settled the matter for everyone but him. He walked with one eye on the pasture and one eye on the cliffs, as he often did. In the full light of morning, the upper rock looked almost blue, fading into the smooth brightness overhead. The sky itself had a strange quality today, clear but not truly deep. Sometimes he felt as though it sat too close over the valley, like a painted ceiling held just out of reach. Sometimes the stars at night seemed wrong too, bright, sharp, beautiful, but fixed in patterns so regular that he could predict exactly where each one would be when he stepped outside after supper. Old Marek in the square called that nonsense. "Stars move slow," Marek had said, tapping his temple. "Slower than boys think." Maybe so. Still, Vagon watched them. He found Brindle's tracks at the far edge of the pasture, where the ground softened near a line of thorn bush and scrub willow. The hoofprints were fresh. One set only. The calf had slipped through a low break in the fence and wandered toward the northern boundary, where the land sloped upward into broken ground and scattered stones. He swore softly and climbed after her. The farther he went, the quieter the valley became. The sounds of work, the creak of carts, The call of voices, the bark of dogs, faded until all he heard was the wind slipping over grass and the occasional clatter of pebbles under his boots. Few people came this close to the cliff wall. The soil was thin here, and the rock rose in strange shelves that made plowing impossible. Children were told not to play among the stones. Adults had no reason to come. Vagon came anyway, when he could. There were things here that bothered him. Not enough to trouble anyone else, of course. Just small details. A patch of black rock that reflected light like still water. A line along the cliff face, too straight to be natural. The way the air sometimes seemed warmer in one narrow strip than in the rest of the slope, even in winter. Once he had pressed his ear to the ground and thought he heard something deep below. Not water, not shifting stone, but a low, distant vibration, steady as a sleeping heartbeat. He had told Father that one evening while they repaired a plow blade. "Probably your own blood," Father said. "It isn't," Father shrugged. "Then leave the ground to its secrets. It's done no harm." That was the difference between them. Father could let a mystery lie if it fed no one and broke nothing. Vagon felt every unanswered question like a splinter in his skin. He followed the tracks past a stand of wiry brush and over a lip of stone into a shallow hollow he had never seen before. Brindle stood there with her head lowered, calmly chewing at a patch of coarse grass as if she had not just earned herself an extra hour of rope work. "You miserable creature," Vagon said with relief. The calf licked one ear. He stepped toward her, then stopped. Something was wrong with the wall behind her. At first he thought it was shadow. The cliff curved inward here, and the morning light fell oddly across the surface. But as he moved left, then right, the shape remained the same. A broad vertical section of stone, too smooth and too even, almost as if a giant blade had cut into the cliff and polished the wound. Vagon forgot the calf at once. He approached slowly. Up close, the difference was unmistakable. The surrounding cliff was rough and weathered, streaked with mineral veins, chipped by time. This section was gray and matte, almost the same color as stone, but when he laid his palm against it, cold shot through his skin. Not the coolness of shade, not the damp chill of rock near water. A dead, metallic cold. His breath caught. He dragged his fingers across the surface. Dust came away, and beneath it lay something that did not feel like stone at all, perfectly smooth without grain or crack. He knelt and brushed at the lower edge. Dirt flaked off in clumps. A line emerged, straight, sharp. A seam. Vagon sat back on his heels and stared. "No," he whispered, though no one was there to hear him. Brindle tugged at the grass behind him. He stood and began scraping with both hands, ignoring the dirt grinding into his nails. More of the edge appeared, then an angle, then another vertical line. Whatever this was, it was built into the cliff itself. Tall, rectangular, and hidden so thoroughly beneath soil and time that only a wandering calf had led him to it. His heart pounded hard enough to hurt. He should go back. He should get Father, or the council, or old Senna, who remembered more stories than anyone living and might know whether some ancestor had spoken of such a place. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder at the empty slope, listened to the silence, and kept digging. By midday, he had uncovered enough to convince himself he was not mad. The object, door, if that was what it was, stood roughly twice his height and wider than a cart. Its surface bore no handle, no hinges, no markings he could recognize at first glance. It had been fitted into the cliff with impossible precision, its edges flush and seamless except where the dirt had trapped itself along the lines. A strip on one side looked slightly darker than the rest, as if made from another material. Vagon finally tied Brindle's rope to a scrub root and forced himself to leave. He covered the exposed lower seam as best he could with loose brush before leading the calf back down. All through the afternoon chores, the hidden thing in the cliff sat in the back of his mind like a hot coal. He fed the sheep. He mended a gate slat. He hauled 2 buckets from the lower spring. He heard almost none of the conversations around him. Father noticed by supper. "You're carrying grain in your hands and your head somewhere else," he said. Vagon looked up from the table. The family sat close in the warm kitchen. Father at the end, broad and weathered. Mother dividing stew with the same precise motions she used for every task. Dalen kicking lightly at Vagon's ankle under the bench. Grandmother Ilia wrapped in her gray shawl by the hearth, her cloudy eyes reflecting the fire. Outside, evening deepened against the window glass. "I found a break in the north fence," Vagon said, because it was partly true. And Brindle got through," Dalen snorted. "Brindle goes where she pleases." Mother set down the ladle. "Did you fix it?" "Tomorrow." Father tore bread with both hands. "Then your head can return with the rest of you by morning." Vagon almost told them then. The words rose to his throat and stopped there. He imagined Father's skepticism, Mother's worry, Dalen's demands to be taken along, and the council hearing of it before he understood anything himself. Worst of all, he imagined someone else going to the cliff before dawn and finding what he had found, touching it, opening it, claiming the answer that had somehow waited all this time for him. He lowered his eyes to his bowl. "Yes, Father." That night, he lay awake longer than usual. The house settled around him with small, familiar sounds. The creak of beams, Dalen's soft snore from the other side of the partition, the occasional pop from the dying hearth fire. Through the narrow window above his bed, he could see a slice of sky framed by the eaves. The stars were there, fixed, exact, bright enough to prick the black with silver. Vagon had spent years trying to prove to himself that they changed. He had scratched their positions into bits of wood, marked the paths he thought they took, compared one season to another. They were not identical every night, no, but there was a pattern to them, so precise it felt arranged. As if the sky turned by rule rather than nature, he thought of the cold surface under his hand, a seam in the cliff, something hidden under the valley's skin. He turned onto his side and closed his eyes, but sleep would not come. Before first light, he was dressed and out of the house. Mist clung low over the fields. The village still slept, except for the bakers and 2 shepherd boys driving a drowsy flock toward the southern meadow. Vagon took a spade from the tool shed, tucked a lantern under his arm, though dawn was already graying the horizon, and slipped north with a piece of yesterday's bread in his pocket. He told himself he was only going to look. The mist thinned as he climbed. By the time he reached the hidden hollow, the valley below lay open and pale in the new light. No one had followed him. The brush he had pulled across the lower edge of the thing sat undisturbed. Brindle was gone, thankfully. Smarter than she looked, Vagon set down the lantern and spade and got to work in earnest. Soil came away faster with a blade than with bare hands. He carved it loose in careful strips, exposing more of the metallic surface inch by inch. Dust coated his sleeves. Small stones skittered downhill. After an hour, then 2, his shoulders burned and sweat ran cold between his shoulder blades despite the morning chill. As more of the structure emerged, so did its strange perfection. The rectangle extended deeper than he had thought. On the right side, level with his chest, he uncovered a narrow panel the size of a dinner plate, inset into the metal and outlined by another fine seam. Unlike the rest of the surface, this piece was dark and glossy beneath the dirt. Vagon crouched in front of it, breathing hard. He cleaned it with the edge of his sleeve. A faint reflection looked back at him. A narrow face, dark hair plastered to his forehead, eyes too wide. There were symbols on the panel, not letters from the old prayer book. Not the tally marks used in the storehouse, not anything he knew. Tiny shapes in neat rows, some faded, some still oddly sharp. One of them, a circle bisected by a short line, sat apart from the others. He reached out, then hesitated. This was the moment, he thought, the turning point between not knowing and whatever came next. People in stories always crossed such thresholds with certainty. Vagon felt none. He felt 17 years of warnings, every elder's caution, every proverb about old places and buried dangers. He also felt the pull that had haunted him since childhood whenever he looked at the cliffs and thought, this cannot be all there is. He pressed the symbol. Nothing happened. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and almost laughed at himself. Of course nothing happened. It was a dead relic, a remnant, some strange old construction swallowed by the valley long before his grandparents were born. Then, the panel lit beneath his hand. Vegan jerked back so hard, he nearly fell. A pale line of blue-white light ran around the edge of the inset panel, thin as a reed stem, then steadied. Dust trickled from somewhere higher up with a dry hiss. Deep inside the cliff, something answered. A faint, mechanical sound, like gears waking after a very long sleep. The air changed. He felt it on his face first. A current, weak but unmistakable, slipping through a seam that had not been open a heartbeat ago. No, he whispered again. But this time it meant, yes, it was real. Yes, it was happening. The lights on the panel flickered. Several symbols glowed in sequence too quickly for him to follow. Then, a dull clang sounded from within the metal wall, followed by a grinding vibration under his boots. The entire rectangular slab shuddered. Vagon stumbled backward, snatching up the lantern by instinct even though it wasn't lit. Soil spilled from the edges as the hidden door, because it was a door, there could be no doubt now, began to withdraw into the cliff by finger widths. A black line opened down one side. Dust poured from it in a long, dry breath, carrying with it a smell unlike anything in the valley. Stale air, metal, and something sharp and old, as if lightning had once been trapped inside and forgotten. The gap widened. Darkness lay beyond. Not the soft darkness of a cellar or a cave, but a manufactured blackness, flat and absolute. When the door had opened enough to reveal an entrance, the motion stopped. Silence rushed back over the hollow. Vagon stood motionless, staring at the space he had uncovered. The cliff no longer looked like a cliff. It looked like a disguise that had finally failed. He should run. He knew that with sudden, perfect clarity. Run downhill! Find father! Bring everyone! Let wiser people decide what to do. But wisdom had never opened a buried door. He stepped closer instead. The opening was wide enough for a cart, though only just. He held the lantern up into the gap and saw almost nothing. The morning light entered a short distance and died on smooth walls. The floor inside was level, not stone, but dark metal ribbed with narrow grooves. The corridor beyond stretched straight into the mountain at a slight downward angle, vanishing into shadow. No roots had pierced it, no insect stirred, no moss grew. It was as if time itself had stood still on the other side of that threshold. Vagon set the lantern down, fumbled in his satchel for flint and tinder, and lit it with trembling hands. The flames steadied after a moment, throwing a circle of amber over the doorway. In that light, he saw more details. Dust layered thick across the floor, strange rectangular fixtures mounted high on the walls, and beyond them, more sealed doors set at intervals into either side of the passage. Built, all of it built. His mouth had gone dry. He looked back once. From here, the valley seemed impossibly peaceful. Terraces green in the morning sun, threads of smoke rising from chimneys. the stream flashing in its bend, the enclosed little world that had shaped every life he had ever known. If he walked away now, he could almost believe the opening behind him would close and vanish, and become one more secret folded under stone. But he knew himself too well for that. Vagon lifted the lantern and crossed the threshold. The temperature dropped immediately. The air inside was still and stale, cold enough to raise bumps on his arms. The sounds of the valley faded after only a few steps, until he could hear nothing but the faint rasp of his own breathing and the tiny creak of leather as he moved. Behind him, daylight framed the entrance in a hard white rectangle. Ahead lay only darkness and the narrow gold tremor of his lantern flame. He took another step and another. The corridor walls swallowed light. Dust lay thick, except where some old draft had swirled it into crescent patterns. On the left side, halfway up the wall, a strip of cloudy material ran unbroken into the dark. Glass, perhaps, or something like it. Beneath it sat panels dotted with dead circles and blank squares. He touched one with his fingertips and snatched his hand back at the cold. What place was this? Who had built it? And how could it exist inside the cliff when no one in the valley knew such things could be made? A few paces farther on, the lantern beam caught a sign fixed to the wall. More of the unknown symbols. Beneath them was a shape he did understand. An arrow pointing deeper inside. Vagon swallowed. For one wild instant, he imagined people beyond the dark, hidden generations, another settlement tucked behind the cliffs, a forgotten branch of the valley who had kept other knowledge alive. But the dust was too thick, the silence too complete. No one had walked here in a very, very long time. He moved forward until the daylight behind him seemed thin and far away, no more than a distant wound in the dark. The corridor bent slightly ahead. Around that bend, anything might wait. Treasure from old stories, dead machines, poison air, the bones of people who had vanished before his grandfather was born. His fear rose with every step, but so did something stronger. Wonder. At the bend, he stopped and held the lantern high. Beyond it, the corridor opened into a wider chamber, and in the dim edge of the light, he saw the suggestion of shapes. Tall frames, broken consoles, the glint of metal surfaces under centuries of dust. A hidden world. Vagon drew in a long, unsteady breath and went on. The door remained open behind him, and outside the valley carried on with its ordinary morning, unaware that one of its sons had just stepped out of the only world he had ever known. Chapter 2. The Memory of Machines. The chamber beyond the bend had once been bright. Vagon could tell that even before his lantern found the dead light strips in the ceiling, the silvered surfaces beneath their mantles of dust, the ranks of panels and tables arranged with a kind of practiced order no valley workshop had ever possessed. It was not a room made by hand and patience and generations of patchwork repair. It was a room made all at once, to a plan with materials and methods beyond anything he knew. His lantern flame wavered as he stepped inside. Dust softened everything. It lay in drifts along the edges of the floor, coated the long consoles that curved in a half circle around the room, and blurred the glassy faces of upright cabinets whose dark interiors held coils, rods, and shapes he could not name. On one wall, a great cracked display stretched from shoulder height nearly to the ceiling. Its black surface reflected the lantern as a trembling gold blot. At the center of the chamber stood a chair on a raised platform, ringed by more dead controls. It looked like a throne abandoned by some machine king. Vagon moved carefully, each footstep marking a clear print through the dust. He kept expecting some hidden danger to spring loose beneath his touch, some ancient trap to wake and remind him he had no right to be there. Nothing did. Only the room's silence remained, dense and watchful. He passed a bank of narrow shelves. Thin objects lay stacked there in decayed bindings, some metal, some a brittle material like layered bark. He reached for one and stopped when it crumbled under his fingers. Age had been at work here longer than memory. On the far side of the room, he found another door standing partly open. Beyond it lay a smaller chamber lined with bunks built into the walls, each with straps and small compartments beside them. A cup still sat clipped in one recess, its surface dulled to gray. In another room, he found lockers with their doors hanging ajar, clothing folded inside, so neatly it made his throat tighten for reasons he could not explain. The garments were unlike valley clothes, seamless in places, fitted in strange ways, made of fabrics that still gleamed faintly under the dust. People had lived here. Real people, not spirits or story figures. People who had slept, stored their things, walked these corridors, spoken in voices now long gone. He backed out of the sleeping room and returned to the central chamber, his pulse climbing again. The hidden place was larger than he had imagined, branching passages leading away in several directions. He could spend days exploring and still not see it all. But the room with the raised chair felt important, intentional, a center. The lantern light slid over the half-circle of consoles, and for the first time, he noticed that one panel near the middle was not entirely dark. A point of green blinked once. Vagon froze. He waited. The green point blinked again. Slow, weak, regular. He approached as one might approach a wounded animal that still had teeth. The console was chest-high, its surface smooth and slanted, marked by rows of dead symbols and dim inset windows. Most of it seemed as dead as the rest. But near the center, beneath a veil of dust, one narrow strip pulsed faintly. He brushed the dust away. The green light brightened for a heartbeat, then dimmed again. There was writing next to it, not the valley script, but a neater older form like the fragments in Grandmother Ilya's prayer book. Sharp-angled, formal, difficult. Vagon sounded it out under his breath, painfully, letter by letter. He only half understood the old forms, and these were stranger still, but one word emerged with startling clarity. Core. Below it, another word he could not read. He looked around the chamber, suddenly aware of how deep beneath the valley he stood, of how alone. "Hello!" he said aloud, and immediately felt foolish. The green light blinked on, off, on. Nothing answered. He set the lantern down on the console. Its warm glow spread across the panel, waking reflections in a dozen dark surfaces. His eyes caught on a shallow depression near the blinking strip, shaped almost like a hand laid flat with fingers slightly spread. Not a perfect hand, but close enough. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, because he had already opened one impossible door that morning, he placed his hand into the hollow. At once, a tone sounded, soft, low, and clear enough to make him flinch. Light rippled outward beneath a panel in lines of white and pale blue. The room answered in layers, clicks in the walls, a deep hum beneath the floor, the sudden hiss of air forced through vents that had not breathed in centuries. Somewhere far off, something heavy shuddered into motion and then stopped. Vagon snatched his hand back. The green point became 3 amber bars. The cracked black wall display across the room flickered. Bright static flared, vanished, returned. Letters swam into being across it in columns he could not read. Several consoles lit with weak, sickly glows. One failed with a shower of sparks and a sharp pop that made him stumble away, but the rest held. The hum deepened. Then a voice said, "From nowhere and everywhere at once. Biometric mismatch. Lineage variance within acceptable range." Vagon spun in a full circle, reaching for the knife at his belt. The voice was neither man nor woman. It held no breath, no grain of throat or tongue, only a strange flat clarity with a faint distortion crackling beneath it, like distant ice. "Identity unresolved," it continued. "Please remain calm." Vagon did the opposite. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice sounding small in the chamber. A pause followed, as if the room itself were considering him. Then, "Local interface restoration incomplete. Auditory output rerouted. Please state designation." Vagon backed away from the console until his calves struck the raised platform. "Show yourself." Unable. That stopped him. The answer had come at once, without threat, almost without emotion. "Unable?" he repeated. "Physical service units non-functional. Visual projection systems unavailable in this sector. Auditory interface is primary remaining communication method." Vagon's fingers tightened around the knife hilt. "What are you?" Another pause. Somewhere in the walls, relays clicked like old bones. "I am Settlement Guidance Intelligence Core 7, Valley Biosphere Section, Colonial Transport Vessel Asterion. Current status: severe degradation. Continuity preserved at 2.3%. Functional capacity limited." The words struck him one after another, most of them meaningless. Settlement, intelligence, vessel. Only one phrase fixed itself in his mind. "Valley Biosphere," he repeated. "Confirmed." His mouth had gone dry again. "You said Valley? This environmental module is designated Valley Biosphere 3. He looked around wildly, as if the answer might be written on the walls. "This place is under the North Cliff." "Incorrect at full scale," the voice said. "This place is integrated within primary habitable interior shell." Vagon understood less with every sentence. Panic fluttered in his chest like a trapped bird. "I don't know what that means." "Confirmed," said the voice. "Archive continuity loss remains extensive." Something in that, something almost like weariness. If a voice without breath could be weary, cut through his fear. He swallowed and forced himself to ask the one question that mattered. Who built this? The Asterion colonial mission was commissioned and launched from Earth under the Outer Settlement Accord. Stop. Vagon pressed both hands to his head as if he could hold the words in place. "Say it so I can understand." Silence followed long enough that he thought the thing, whatever it was, had failed. Then the voice returned, slower. "This place was made by your ancestors." Vagon stared at the dead display wall. "No," he said. "Confirmed biological correlation indicates descent from registered settler population." "No," he said again, but weaker now. "Would you like simplified historical summary?" He thought of turning and running. He thought of sunlight, fields, the stream, the ordinary ache of lifting water buckets and mending fences. He thought of never speaking to the thing again. Instead, he heard himself say, "Yes." A soft tone sounded. On the wall display, the static settled into a dim field of gray. Shapes emerged, blurred at first, then sharper. A sphere hung in darkness, blue and white and clouded. Vagon sucked in a breath. It was a world. Not a map, not a symbol. A world seen from far away. "This is Earth," said the voice. The image changed. A black field filled with uncountable stars. Then, a streak of light crossing between them. Colonial transport vessel Asterion departed Earth with settlers, equipment, agricultural stock, embryos, fabrication systems, and autonomous construction drones. Mission duration exceeded baseline human lifespan. Therefore, a generational continuity habitat was required. The image shifted again. Now, Vagon saw something that made his knees weaken. A vast irregular shape floated in darkness, stone and metal fused together. Great engine structures protruded from one end. Along one side, lights shone in rings and windows, and cut into the body of the thing, impossibly green against the surrounding hull, lay a long oval valley under a curved inner shell. His valley, the fields, the stream, the terraces, the orchard lines, tiny from a distance, but unmistakable. Vagon grabbed the edge of the console to steady himself. "No," he whispered for the third time, though the word had lost all force. "This vessel was constructed from a hollowed asteroid," said the voice. Interior habitats were carved and seeded to sustain human life during transit. Valley Biosphere 3 was designed for agricultural production, ecological stability, and psychological comfort. Livestock and open land simulation were included to preserve social continuity and quality of life during voyage. Vagon heard the words, but only fragments stuck. Hollowed asteroid, transit, psychological comfort. He stared at the image of the valley suspended inside the vast stone shell, and understood, with a sickness that seemed to tilt the whole room around him, that the cliffs had never enclosed a world. They had enclosed a room. He thought of the sky that felt too close, the stars that moved wrong, the wind patterns that repeated, the metallic hum beneath the soil. All at once, every old unease found its answer. He stepped backward until he struck the raised chair and nearly fell over it. "The valley isn't outside." "Correct. The sky. Projected environmental dome. The cliffs. Structural boundaries and geological shielding. The stars. Simulation based on external astronomical data and circadian design." Vagon made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a gasp. "You're saying we live inside a stone." "A hollowed asteroid transport vessel," the voice corrected. He slid down onto the lowest edge of the platform and sat hard, lantern at his feet, staring at nothing. For several moments, there was only the hum under the floor. Then he said, very quietly, "How long?" Elapsed transit time from launch, 812 years, 4 months, 19 days. Vagon shut his eyes. 800 years meant nothing. It was too large. The valley kept count by seasons, by births and harvests and winters hard enough to kill the old trees. 800 years belonged to legend, not memory. And yet, memory, he realized, was exactly what this place had become. He opened his eyes again. Why doesn't anyone know? At that, the lights in the room dimmed and surged, as if the question itself had disturbed something buried deep in the system. "Catastrophic continuity failure," said the voice. "Would you like incident summary?" Vagon almost said no. "Yes." The wall display flickered. The image of the asteroid dissolved into lines of red crossing through sections of its interior. During Generation Phase 41, a cascading systems event originated in propulsion maintenance and power distribution sectors. Root causes included reactor instability, deferred repair cycles, and unauthorized manual override of educational archive partitioning during emergency load shedding. Vagon stared blankly. The voice adjusted again. Parts of the ship began to fail. It said slower. Power was redirected to keep the vessel moving and to preserve life support. Some systems were shut down on purpose. Others broke on their own. Images flashed. Corridors venting air into darkness. Fire blooming down a shaft. Sealed bulkheads slamming shut. The learning archives were among the systems damaged or isolated, not all at once, first partially, then completely. Teachers lost access to records, tools, technical guidance, and external history. Many trained personnel died during the failures in the outer sectors. Others were trapped away from the valley habitats. The display now showed highlighted green pockets within the asteroid, the surviving habitable zones, and vast dead regions in black. The valley remained stable because it had independent agricultural support, water cycling, and atmospheric buffering. Survivors withdrew here and to 2 other habitats. Long-term restoration plans required technical knowledge no longer available. Over generations, remaining records fragmented. Oral transmission degraded. Mission identity was reinterpreted through myth. Vagon thought of grandmother Ilya's stories by the hearth, of the time before spoken like a softened prayer. He thought of the old prayer book with half its pages unreadable, and the children reciting words they no longer understood. He thought of Father telling him that the ground was entitled to its secrets. Not secrets, then. Wreckage. We forgot, he said, confirmed. The simplicity of it hurt more than the impossible truths. We forgot everything? Not everything. Agricultural practice remained. Basic medicine, toolcraft, social organization, selected symbolic language. But core mission knowledge, engineering literacy, astronomical context, and vessel operation protocols were lost. Vagon looked up sharply. Other habitats? You said there were others. Were, the voice replied. No active biosignatures detected in adjacent habitat sectors. Valley Biosphere 3 is current sole confirmed continuous human population. The room seemed colder after that. Vagon imagined other enclosed worlds somewhere beyond the metal walls. Another valley, perhaps, or forests or barracks. All dark now. Empty for generations. He rubbed both hands over his face. Dust streaked his skin. And you? He asked. Why didn't you tell us? For the first time, the answer did not come immediately. My access to Valley Biosphere 3 was severed during the continuity failure, the intelligence said at last. Core systems entered preservation mode after multiple hardware losses. Autonomous repair units in this sector failed. Wake thresholds remained active, but no authorized interface contact occurred for a pause. 561 years. Vagon stared. You were asleep. Low power standby, yes, and I woke you. Confirmed. He let that sit between them. Then, another thought struck him, sudden and sharp enough to make him stand again. You said the vessel kept moving, if it never stopped. He looked toward the dark ceiling as though he might somehow see through layers of stone and machinery. Where are we now? The wall display brightened. A star appeared. Not the pale sun lamp arc of the valley sky, but a fierce white point against absolute black. Around it revolved several smaller lights. One of them swelled larger, resolving into a world banded with cloud and land masses unlike any map he had ever seen. We have reached the target system, said the voice. Primary deceleration concluded 6 days ago. Orbital insertion in progress. Colonial destination achieved. Vagon could only stare. Reached. Not traveling, then. Arrived. The journey is over, he asked. Transit phase is ending, the intelligence replied. Settlement phase should have begun according to mission schedule. Approximately 403 years ago. Delays occurred due to systems failure. The display changed once more. Now he saw the planet from lower altitude, and on its surface, in the midst of a broad plain near a river and jagged mountain range, stood geometric clusters of silver-white structures connected by roads or tracks, towers, domes, landing circles. Order imposed on wilderness. What is that? Surface Reception Base 1, said the voice. Constructed by autonomous drones launched in advance of arrival. Status. Standing. Intermittent power signatures confirmed. Environmental shelters intact. Fabrication arrays partially operational. Vegan moved closer to the display until his breath fogged the dim glass. Built! Waiting. All this time, while generations lived and died under the false sky of the valley, machines had crossed a new world and built them a home. For us, he said. Confirmed. Initial settlement infrastructure was completed before major continuity failure aboard vessel. Surface systems then entered automated holding pattern awaiting human transfer. He thought of the fields above him, of the oxen, the rows of winter root, the worn handles of tools smoothed by generations of hands. He tried to place those things beside the bright, impossible structures on the display, and could not. They'll never believe me, he said. That assessment is statistically likely. Despite everything, Vegan barked a short, startled laugh. The voice continued, however, environmental truth state will soon become increasingly difficult to conceal. What does that mean? Current valley dome systems remain unstable. Orbital transition and station-keeping procedures require power redistribution. Projection continuity may degrade. Additionally, atmospheric and navigational systems for transfer operations must be restored. Vegan's brief laugh vanished. Transfer operations? The vessel will no longer function primarily as long-range transit body. Planned repurposing after arrival. Orbital station, logistics hub, agricultural reserve, and manufacturing support for system-wide settlement. Population transfer to Surface Reception Base 1 will occur via shuttlecraft. The word meant nothing to him, but the wall display provided an image. A compact winged craft descending through cloud toward the waiting base. He looked from the craft to the planet below. We go down there. Confirmed. All of us? Mission objective requires phased relocation of population, livestock genetics, seed banks, and critical cultural resources. The asteroid station will remain in orbit as central infrastructure. Long-term projections indicate expansion from initial planetfall to multi-body settlement across the star system. The room hummed steadily, as if the ship itself approved. Vegan felt suddenly very small, not just as one boy in one valley, but as one brief human life standing between 800 years of forgetting and an entire future no one around him had even imagined. He thought of father at the table, suspicious of anything that disrupted the order of the day. Mother, who measured truth by what kept a family fed and safe. Dalen, who would believe the impossible at once and ask 10 dangerous questions before he could answer one. Grandmother Ilya, who might hear all of this and whisper that at last the stories had remembered themselves. How long do we have, he asked, before full disclosure becomes unavoidable? Indeterminate. Before minimal transfer systems must be restored. Approximately 54 hours. Before current orbital window for efficient surface descent begins to close. 92 hours. Vegan blinked. Hours? The intelligence was silent for a beat, then said, less than 4 valley days. That landed properly. 4 days. The valley above was still feeding chickens and patching roofs and arguing over whose sheep had broken the south hedge. In 4 days, if this thing was telling the truth, the sky itself might fail. Vegan pressed both palms to the console and leaned over it, breathing hard. Then tell me what to do. For the first time since it had awakened, the voice seemed to sharpen. Priority actions. Restore access to primary valley interfaces. Stabilize power flow to atmospheric and projection subsystems to prevent catastrophic panic event. Reactivate hangar approach corridors. Verify shuttle readiness and initiate controlled truth disclosure to population leaders. Vegan closed his eyes. In words I understand. A pause. Wake more of the ship, it said. Keep the valley from breaking all at once. Bring your people here before the sky tells them on its own. That, at least, he understood. He opened his eyes and looked again at the planet on the display. Its clouds turned slowly over continents no human from the valley had ever seen. Somewhere on its surface stood a base built by patient machines for descendants who had forgotten why they were born. "Can you show me the way back?" he asked. "Yes." "Can you show me how to prove this?" "Yes." He swallowed. "Can you help me make them believe?" The answer came after a longer pause than before. "I can provide evidence," said the intelligence. "Belief remains a human variable." Vagon let out a breath that might almost have been a laugh, if not for the fear in it. Right. The chamber lights flickered again, slightly brighter than before. On one side of the room, a sealed door unlocked with a heavy clunk. Beyond it, a corridor glowed to life in dim amber strips along the floor, leading deeper into the hidden structure. "Follow illuminated path," said the voice. "I will guide you to local systems access. Additional warning, some sectors remain structurally unsound. Do not deviate without instruction." Vagon picked up his lantern, though he no longer needed it as much. Its small human flame looked fragile beside the returning machine. Light, but he kept it anyway. Before he stepped toward the newly opened corridor, he hesitated and looked back at the display one last time. The image had shifted again. The asteroid, no, the vessel, the station to be, hung above the planet like a dark, broken moon lined with human lights. It was enormous, scarred, ancient, still alive. And somewhere inside it, the valley waited under its false sky, unaware that its world had already ended, and that another waited below. "Vagon," the voice said. He stiffened. "I didn't tell you my name." "No," said the intelligence. "You did not. But localized census fragments cross-referenced with biosignature lineage and current population estimates suggest a 91% probability." Vagon almost smiled despite himself. "Only 91? Data loss remains extensive." He shook his head. "Then yes. Vagon." "Confirmed," said the voice. "Welcome to operations. Vagon of Valley Biosphere 3. He did not feel welcomed. He felt frightened, burdened, and far too young. But he also felt something else beneath the fear now, a terrible, expanding wonder. He stepped into the lit corridor. Behind him, in the chamber of dust and dead centuries, the wall display kept turning through its recovered images. Earth, the long voyage, the waiting planet below, while the intelligence that had slept through generations of forgetting spoke softly into the hollow heart of the asteroid, guiding at last the first human who had come back to listen. Chapter 3. The World Beyond the Valley. When Vagon came back out into daylight, the valley looked exactly as it always had. That was the worst part. The terraces still stepped down the slopes in patient green bands. Thin smoke still lifted from cook fires. The stream still folded silver through the fields. Somewhere below, a dog barked twice and stopped. The world he had left behind only a few hours earlier had not changed at all. Only he had. He stood in the hidden hollow with one hand braced against the cold metal of the open door and tried to understand how both things could be true at once. Above him, the false sky arched in its perfect morning blue. Around him, the cliffs rose in their old familiar circle. But now, every line of the valley had become double in his mind. Field and system, cliff and wall, sky and screen, home and machine. Pathway closure available, said the voice behind him from somewhere inside the corridor. Vagon flinched. He was still not used to hearing it from empty air. "No," he said quickly. "Leave it." Warning. Unauthorized discovery by additional inhabitants remains possible. He almost laughed at that. After what he had seen, the idea of anyone being authorized for anything seemed absurd. "Good," he said at last. Maybe it should be. He picked up the spade he had dropped outside and began dragging brush back over the entrance anyway. Not enough to hide it fully, only enough to keep some wandering child or stray animal from stumbling in before he returned with others. His hands moved by habit while his mind raced ahead. 4 days. Less, if the intelligence was wrong in the dangerous direction. He looked once more into the darkness beyond the threshold. "Can you hear me if I'm outside?" "Within limited range," the voice replied. "Relay continuity to this entrance remains functional." Vagon nodded. "Then wait." "I have been waiting," it said. He left at a near run. By the time he reached the lower paths, the valley had fully entered the day. Women were carrying baskets toward the drying sheds. The mill wheel creaked steadily. A pair of children chased each other between the orchard rows until their mother shouted them back. Old Marek sat on his stool near the meeting post, carving one of his endless hooks from a block of rootwood. He looked up as Vagon passed and frowned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Vagon slowed without meaning to. "Not a ghost," he thought. "A memory. Just a long climb," he said. Marek grunted. "Then slow down before you kill yourself from excitement over a fence post." Vagon almost kept moving, but the absurd normalness of the exchange struck him so hard that he stopped in the road. The old man squinted up at him. "What?" Vagon opened his mouth. What could he possibly say? The valley is inside a hollowed asteroid. The sky is a machine. We have arrived at another star, and there's a planet waiting below us. He heard the words in his head and knew at once how they would sound spoken aloud in daylight among turnip carts and wool sacks. Marek snorted. "If you're ill, go home." Vagon went home. Father was in the tool shed repairing a seed drill when Vagon reached the yard. He did not look up at first. "You remembered how to return?" Then he said. "Good. Fetch the iron pins from the shelf." Vagon stood in the doorway, breathing hard. "Father." Something in his voice made the older man look up. The hammer stopped moving. "What happened?" Vagon had rehearsed nothing. He had no sensible order for the impossible, so he said the truest thing first. "I found something in the north cliff." Father set the hammer down carefully. "What kind of something?" "A door." For a heartbeat, only the wind moved through the half-open shed. Then Father's expression closed. "A cave, you mean?" "No." "A split in the rock." "No." Vagon stepped forward. A metal door built into the cliff. "Hidden." I opened it. That got him. Not belief, but attention. Father straightened slowly. "You did what?" "There's a whole place behind it. Rooms, corridors, machines, and..." He hesitated only a moment. "A voice." Father stared at him long enough that Vagon felt the first edge of panic. Then he said in the measured tone one used with the feverish or the foolish, "Sit down." "I'm not sick." "I didn't say you were." "Sit." Vagon did not sit. "You have to listen to me." "I am listening." "No, you're waiting to tell me I imagined it." Father's jaw tightened. "If you want me to believe you found a hidden metal door in the cliff and a talking spirit under the ground, yes, I may need a little patience before I arrive at that conclusion. It isn't a spirit. What is it then?" Vagon heard the answer forming and knew how mad it would sound. Still, he said it. "It's a machine that remembers where we came from." Father's silence this time was not skeptical. It was wary. Behind them, a shadow moved in the yard. Grandmother Elia stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, gray shawl around her narrow shoulders. Vagon had not heard her approach. "A machine that remembers," she said softly. "That's an old phrase." Father swore under his breath. "Mother, don't encourage him." But Ilya's cloudy gaze was fixed on Vagon. "Where?" "The North Cliff," he said. "Near the broken fence above the thorn hollow." She gave a tiny nod. as if some private piece had slid into place. I wondered if it would be there. Father turned to her so sharply that the tools on the bench rattled. You knew? No, she said. Not new. Remembered a remembering. Neither of them understood her when she spoke like that half the time. Usually Father dismissed it as age, turning old stories into knots. But Vagon saw something in her expression now that tightened the air in the shed. There were older songs, she said. Before my grandmother's time, they were longer. Not just harvest blessings and names of the dead, pieces of other things, a road of iron under the hill, the buried keepers, the fields carried through the dark. She looked at Vagon. Most were thrown away when people stopped understanding them. Father rubbed a hand over his face. That doesn't make his story true. No, she agreed, but it makes it old. That was enough. Not enough for belief, but enough for movement. By midday, Vagon had convinced Father, Grandmother Elian, and to his horror Dalen, who refused to be left behind once she realized something important was happening, to climb with him to the hidden hollow. Mother had wanted to come too, but someone had to stay and keep questions from spreading before Vagon was ready, or before he had proof. We'll have proof in a minute, Dalen whispered as they climbed. She sounded delighted. If it eats us, I want it known I was against staying home. You were not. I was against staying home once I knew it was interesting. Father shot them both a look over his shoulder. Quiet. The brush Vagon had dragged over the entrance had already begun to slip aside. The metallic surface beneath caught the afternoon light with a dull gray sheen. Dalen gasped. Father said nothing for several seconds. Then he walked straight to the exposed seam and laid his calloused hand against the metal. Vagon watched recognition arrive not as understanding, but as the collapse of certainty. He saw his father feel the unnatural cold and know at once that stone did not hold it. This was here, Father said quietly. All this time. Grandmother Elian touched the dark panel with the reverence some people used for relics. Open it? Vagon pressed the symbol. The panel lit at once. Dalen yelped and leapt back, nearly colliding with Father. The door shuddered, then withdrew into the cliff with the same deep, grinding vibration as before. Dust spilled down. Stale, cold air breathed outward. Beyond it, darkness waited. No one spoke. Then, from within the passage, the voice said, Additional inhabitants detected. Dalen made a strangled sound. Father took one involuntary step in front of the others, as if a knife and a stubborn will could protect them from whatever lay inside. Who said that? He demanded. I am Settlement Guidance Intelligence Core 7, the voice replied. Auditory interface active. Please, do not obstruct entrance threshold, Dalen whispered. It talks like a book. Grandmother Elian crossed herself with the old valley sign, and then, astonishingly, smiled. No, she murmured. Books talk like it. What followed was not belief. It was something much harsher and slower. Vagon led them down the corridor into the control chamber. Father kept one hand on Dalen's shoulder and the other close to his belt knife. Elian walked as if entering a chapel she had dreamed of since childhood. When the wall display woke and showed the valley suspended inside the asteroid's hollow shell, Father cursed aloud. Dalen began to cry without sound, tears standing bright in her eyes while she stared at the curved false sky arched above the green interior world she had thought was all of creation. The intelligence explained, slowly, repeatedly, in simpler words when Vagon asked, in older terms when Elian unexpectedly understood fragments of the formal speech. Father interrupted often. No, start there. What do you mean, not real sky? How can rock travel? You're telling me the stars are outside us? The answers came as steadily as water over stone. Not enough to make any of it less impossible, but enough to build shape around the impossible, by the time the image of the waiting planet appeared and the surface space turned beneath it like a promise no one had known enough to keep, Father had gone very still. "It's built already," he said. "Confirmed," said the intelligence. "For us, confirmed. For our children, confirmed. For all the dead who never knew what they were meant to reach." His voice roughened on the final words. No one answered that. At last, Father looked at Vigon, not as one looks at a reckless boy who has climbed where he ought not, but as one looks at someone who has come back carrying fire. "What do we do?" That question moved things. By evening, the council was in uproar. Vigon had insisted on telling them before the sky forced the truth on them in some more terrible way. Father backed him. That mattered. Grandmother Ilya's presence mattered more than he would have guessed. Even those who dismissed her riddling stories listened when she stood in the meeting hall and said, in a voice thinner than age should have allowed, "Our ancestors did not dream enough. We are the ones who dreamed too little." Still, panic came. Marek accused Vigon of unleashing a buried curse. One of the shepherd families demanded the entrance be sealed and forgotten. Senna, oldest of the council, asked practical questions until her hands shook. How much food? How much time? If the sky breaks, what of the children? What happens to the animals? What is air outside the valley? The answers Vagon had were not enough. The answers from the intelligence, when relayed aloud, sounded either miraculous or terrifying, depending on who heard them. Then, the valley sky failed for the first time. Not completely. Only for 3 breaths. It happened at dusk. People had spilled out of the meeting hall in argument, voices carrying through the square. Vagon stood on the steps with Father and Dalen when the evening blue overhead rippled like water struck by a stone. Every star that had begun to brighten there smeared into white lines. The western glow vanished for one naked instant. The dome above them turned transparent. Not sky. Not any sky the valley had ever known. Blackness. Endless and absolute. A scatter of hard stars so deep and numerous they made the old projected heavens look like child's paint, and hanging impossibly huge over the northern cliffs, lit by the light of a real sun from beyond the shell, was the curve of a planet. Then the projection slammed back into place. Screams erupted across the square. Someone fell to their knees. A child wailed. Marek, who had called Vansmod before noon, made a sound like an animal in a trap and backed against the well until his legs gave out beneath him. Vayan felt Dalen grip his arm so hard her nails bit through his sleeve. "Well," she said faintly, with tears still drying on her face. That's one way to settle an argument. After that, denial mostly died, not fear. Fear spread faster. The next 2 days became a tearing open of the valley's entire idea of itself. Under the guidance of the intelligence, Vayan, Father Senna and a handful of others made repeated trips into the hidden base. They learned routes. They opened more sealed passages. Dim strips of floor light came alive, where none had burned in centuries. Vents exhaled stale air, and then fresher currents. Doors groaned back into use. In one deep section beneath the valley, they found storehouses of seed vaults and livestock genetic archives no one living had words for. In another, they reached hangar access corridors where shuttlecraft sat in long rows beneath layers of dust, sleek as riverfish, waiting with a patience beyond human understanding. Vagon touched the side of the first shuttle he saw and felt the future become solid. It was real. All of it. Meanwhile, the valley above strained under truth. Old prayers were repeated and then abandoned. Arguments broke out over what could be carried and what must be left. Some people packed tools. Others packed keepsakes so small and private they looked absurd next to sacks of grain and written records. Mothers marked children's heights on door frames. they would never see again. Men who had never imagined leaving their fields walked them at dawn and dusk, as if memorizing every furrow. Vagon did the same. On the third morning, he stood alone in the upper barley terrace and looked across the valley while the projection dome still held its careful false day. The stream curved through the center, exactly where it always had. Sheep moved like torn bits of cloud over the pasture. His home stood near the orchard line, roof patched 3 different shades, where father had repaired storm damage over the years. He loved it suddenly, with an ache so fierce it nearly doubled him over. Not because it had been a lie, because it had been their lie. And before that, their shelter. And before that, some ancestor's act of mercy. The valley had not betrayed them. It had carried them. Footsteps sounded behind him. Father came up the terrace carrying 2 mugs of hot grain broth. He handed one over and stood beside him without speaking for a while. "It still feels real," Vagon said at last. Father nodded. "It is real." Vagon glanced at him. "The sky isn't," Father said. "The cliffs aren't what we thought. But the fields are fields. We worked them. Your mother bled in them, bringing you into the world. I buried my father on that slope. No machine changes that." Vagon stared down into the steam rising from his mug. After a moment, Father added, "You were right to open the door." It was the closest thing to an apology Vagon had ever heard from him. "That may be the first time you've said that in my life. Don't grow vain over it." Father took a sip. "You were also stupid, but usefully." Vagon laughed then, helplessly, and for the first time in days the laugh did not break halfway through. By the time the orbital window opened, the valley had become a place of departures. The intelligence instructed them in phases. Small groups first, elders and children, seed stores, records, priority tools. Then more people, more supplies, genetic stock, compact fabrication units reactivated from storage, and finally, selected biological materials from the agricultural systems. The asteroid, it told them, would remain in orbit and be restored as a permanent station. Part home, part archive, part ship no longer traveling but not dead. The valley biosphere would not be destroyed. It would become reserve land, training ground, memory. That comforted some. It broke others. The first shuttle launch took place from a hangar large enough to hold half the village. People stood on metal decking under lights whiter and harsher than any they had known. Beyond the open bay doors, black space spread out, and below, visible now through external shielding, hung the waiting world. No projection, no pretense, no valley story, only truth. The shuttlecraft itself looked impossibly small to bear them all, but the intelligence assured them its capacity exceeded visual expectation. Vagon had learned by now that many impossible things were true. Senna boarded first, because she said plainly that if the council would ask others to trust this process, someone old enough to have doubted it publicly should show the courage to go. Grandmother Ilia went with her, light and bird-boned, one hand on Dalen's shoulder. Father stayed for the second shuttle with the heavy equipment crews. Mother, after one long kiss pressed to Vagon's forehead, as if he were still a child, boarded with the first group carrying records and medical stores. Vagon remained at the hangar threshold with a headset looped awkwardly over one ear, listening to the intelligence guide him through procedures he barely understood. Ramp secure. Internal pressure stable. Launch corridor green. Green, Vagon repeated hoarsely to the pilotless craft, as though it needed his permission. The shuttle rose with a vibration more felt than heard. Some in the hangar cried out. Others dropped to their knees again, though this time not from fear alone. It lifted smoothly from the deck, turned toward the open bay, and slipped into blackness with a grace that made it seem almost alive. On the external display, A moving point of light crossed between asteroid and planet. Elian pressed both hands to the glass beside him and whispered, "Odd! We're doing it!" "Yes," Vagon said. Far below, clouds drifted over the world that had waited centuries for them. A cluster of bright marks near a river plain signaled the surface base, already alive with automated landing beacons and reactivated systems. Waiting, ready. The second shuttle followed. Then the third. By the time Vagon himself boarded one of the later runs, the asteroid had already begun to change around them. Docking rings lit in segments. Structural arms extended. Long-dead external systems awakened under the intelligence's careful direction. The world ship that had carried them across the dark was settling into a new identity. No longer only a vessel, but a station in orbit over a settled world. The heart from which everything else would one day spread. Inside the shuttle cabin, the Valley people sat strapped into seats with white knuckles and wide eyes. Children stared openly through the small viewports. One infant slept through launch in its mother's arms, as if crossing from one world to another were no more disruptive than moving rooms. Vagon took the seat by the window. As the shuttle detached, the asteroid filled his view. Seen from outside, it was uglier and grander than any story would have dared. A broken mountain wrapped in metal, scarred by centuries, lit now by new constellations of human work. Openings along its inner shell shone in faint green arcs where biospheres like the valley still lived beneath the rock. Thrusters flashed briefly along its flank to correct orbit. It looked ancient, wounded, magnificent. Home, he thought. Not the only one anymore, but still home. The shuttle turned. The planet rose. Cloud bands, oceans, brown and green land, sunlight striking rivers into silver threads. Everything below seemed too vast to belong to the same people who had spent generations measuring life by fences and harvest bells. Yet the base came into view in time, and with it, something unexpectedly reassuring. Geometry, landing circles, habdomes, storage spines, towers, ordered spaces made in advance by hands that were not hands, waiting for real ones to arrive and continue the work. As they descended, the intelligence's voice came through the cabin speakers. "Surface Reception Base 1 confirms readiness. Atmospheric entry within tolerance. Welcome to settlement phase." No one answered. Several were crying too hard for words. Vagon rested his forehead lightly against the viewport as clouds streamed past. He understood then that arrival was not an ending at all, not even the true beginning. The base below was only the first foothold. The asteroid above would become their station, their harbor in the sky. The planet would become their first world. In time, with archives restored and knowledge relearned, they would go farther still, to moons, to other planets, to stations and outposts and fields under other skies, both real and made. The valley had forgotten the stars. Its children would not. The shuttle broke through the last cloud layer and dropped toward the waiting base, and Vagon, farmer's son, child of a false sky, first of the valley to open the buried door, watched the new world rise up to meet them. Epilogue: The Return of the Signal. Long after the first shuttles had crossed between orbit and planet, long after the landing pads of Surface Reception Base 1 had been marked by the dust and heat of human arrival, the asteroid remained in the sky. It no longer moved through the dark as a silent generational vessel, with its purpose buried beneath broken systems and lost memory. Now it held a new place above the world below. Fixed in orbit, bright with waking sectors, docking lights, and the steady pulse of restored machinery. From the planet's surface, it could be seen at dusk and dawn, hanging above the horizon like an artificial star. Below, the first settlement had already begun to change. Cargo was unloaded. Storage vaults were opened. Water systems were brought fully online. The drone-built structures, once empty and waiting, now held voices, footsteps, arguments, laughter, fear, planning, and the first fragile shape of a future. Fields would come next. Workshops, schools, then observatories, transit routes, foundries, outposts. The work of settling the whole star system had begun, however small its first motions still seemed. And above it all, the asteroid watched, deep inside its restored core, behind sealed bulkheads and corridors still half lost to dust and silence. Old systems continued to return one by one, power grids stabilized, internal archives unlocked in fragments, navigation histories, engineering schematics, population records, and mission protocols emerged from damaged storage like bones from the earth. There was still far more missing than found, but the station was remembering. In the communications spire, one of the longest silent systems on the entire vessel turned at last toward the black between stars. The antenna array had once been meant for regular contact across impossible distances, but centuries of failure had left it frozen and blind. Now, under the guidance of the awakened intelligence and the hands of the first technicians, learning old knowledge anew, its great outer rings, adjusted by precise degrees, internal relays clicked alive, ancient processors warmed. A thin beam of encoded signal reached outward, following coordinates written into the mission before anyone now living had been born. Toward Earth, inside the communications chamber, the light was dim, except for the pale glow of diagnostic bands and the faint reflections running across dust-scored metal. Vagon stood there beside Dalen, father, and two others from the new orbital operations crew, all wearing station headsets that still felt slightly unnatural on them. Through the observation port, the curve of the new planet drifted below, cloud-wrapped and enormous. No one spoke much. The room seemed to ask for quiet. A low tone sounded from the main console. One dormant indicator, dark for generations beyond counting, blinked once, then again. Steady now. The intelligence's voice moved through the chamber, softer here than it had in the control rooms below the valley, as if even it understood the weight of the moment. Long-range handshake acknowledged. Vagon stared at the console. Father said, "From where?" The answer came at once. Origin confirmed. Earth. No one moved. For a brief second, Vagon was no longer on the station above a new world, no longer standing as one of the first settlers at the edge of a star system that would one day be filled with human life. He was also the boy in the valley, lying awake under the wrong stars, wondering why the sky felt too close. Now the distance between that boy and this moment seemed larger than the space between worlds. Another tone sounded. Data began to scroll across the display in lines of symbols. None of them could yet fully read without system assistance. The signal continued to resolve, packet by packet, crossing the final silence between origin and arrival. Dalen let out a slow breath she had clearly been holding. "It came," she whispered. "Yes," said Vagon. On the screen, the transmission marker brightened from pending to received. A message had arrived from Earth. Outside the port, the asteroid station shone above the planet like a second dawn, and below it, the first human settlement of the new system burned with growing light.
Thank you for listening. If you like this story, please subscribe for more.